we're in to answer some of your questions. Welcome to day 1, week 8. So I got frantic phone calls as soon as some of the grades were filled in. So don't freak out. Moodle says you have an F. It ain't true. Okay, the way it works, the program, rather than being a simple spreadsheet, helpfully calculates your grade. I haven't learned to disable this function yet. So if you turned in everything, for example, you'd have 60 to 90 points, minus 1 assignment and the midterm to date, which haven't been entered. So out of a total of 270, it figures, oh, 60 points, you got an F. Right. We haven't turned everything in yet, so duh. Not you, duh, but don't worry. Okay? So, last week, in what was referred to in the syllabus as Society and Addictions, rather than focus, as I have in past years, on how society reinforces addictions, because I think we really covered that already, right? Don't you think? So let's do solutions, which is kind of what I was oriented towards doing. So I chose to focus on how different sectors of society view the problem of addiction and what their solutions consist of. Now, the issue is the quotes, whenever you put something in quotes, is basically you're often taking the position that whatever is in quotes is less than real or less than credible. I'm not saying that. It's not to imply the problem and their solutions are not valid, but they come from a particular worldview. It's kind of like, have I talked about DARE? Okay, so DARE, which I think is largely discredited now as a prevention program. DARE started out in LAPD in the 80s. DARE stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education, just like GREAT was Gang Resistance Education or something like that. Okay, so DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. The idea was to send officers into the school with fancy cars that have been confiscated with drug dealers and kind of do an officer-friendly kind of thing. Not so much scared straight, but basically, okay, drugs are bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it was a drug prevention curriculum, theoretically. Except the reason I'm saying theoretically is that according to the third view of addiction, maladaptive behavior, the science, okay, you actually have to prove what you're doing works, right? So drug prevention curriculums, like those of you who are parents, if there is a drug prevention curriculum in your school, because all schools are supposed to be addressing this, the idea is this, just like any school. So we're a term school, so basically it's three or four terms of 11 weeks each, roughly, right? Semesters do 14 weeks. So within this particular period, you basically do a dose of once a week or twice a week or whatever it is, all right? And you have a 2-hour session, which you then give content to, and then at the end, so it's like a dose, right? And so it's supposed to last over a particular period of time. This is called the effect size, right? Because why would you do something like a DARE curriculum unless it worked, right? So the best prevention curriculum had an effect size of a maximum of 3 years after inoculation. Most falling in the 18-month range, so a year and a half after you stop administering. DARE failed that test. People started using right after they stopped. DARE. So a number of us say, well, so why do they keep doing this? Well, it's because it's cops delivering it, and nobody wanted to say that exposing kids to cops is a bad thing, except what about the neighborhoods where cops aren't considered good guys, or where there's police corruption, or people are, can logically fear for their lives, right? My thing, because, I didn't really, I grew up with LAPD, so, and I didn't particularly like Chief Gates. He, is fairly racist, so why don't we have a drug prevention curriculum that's staffed by EMTs? Nobody minds the fire department. They're glad to see them coming if they actually go to your neighborhood. They're medically trained, and they can eloquently talk about, overdoses and stuff that they've seen in a way that police can't have, but, they didn't do that, right? So the reason I'm saying, for example, this, right, DARE, basically the effect size was like less than 3 months. And in many cases, in terms of, if the idea is to delay the onset of use, right? And if the most effective curriculum delays onset of use, now we're talking about middle school, for 3 years, so that critical period of first use. So if we can delay that critical use, into high school, then that's a great thing. But DARE failed that test, right? So DARE was a solution to a problem. And it didn't really solve the problem, but they kept doing it even though, it took a long time for them to actually reach this conclusion within the study, right? So what often happens, what? Dragging?
The whole wire needs to be bent up.
Okay. Go ahead.
It's dragging on you. There you go.
Okay. Thank you. So, problems and the solutions are not valid. They have their limits and their strengths. And it's useful to be able to talk about what those limits and strengths are in the real world, right? So, I come from a culture that trains me to interrogate cultural assumptions down to the roots to see if they hold up. So, in an interrogation, it's not a friendly questioning. It's like, no, I'm asking you hard questions, and you better come up with the answer. And the inability to come up with an answer means that I'm going to find answers on my own, right? One way or the other. So you might like the culture you're in just fine, and that's fine as long as that works for you. So if we re-examine addictions, right? So ingestive addictions are things you take into your body, also known as substance abuse, eating disorders, and other socially promoted addictions, fast food, etc. So when we talk about, as an example, in prevalence in order of mention in terms of the Recovery Center, these top 4, alcohol, marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine, basically switch being number 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on the season, depending on other local conditions. And then after those top 4 horsemen, if you will, then it's recovery support, even if that's only a day. Then cultural adjustment, people coming here from other places, people coming here from prison, people coming here from the military, people coming here from a more rural environment, people coming here from a urban environment, trying to deal with here, and that's causing a stressor. Tobacco, club drugs, eating disorders. So ingestive addictions in general. So there's 3 recognized factors in substance abuse addictions that this is kind of old, but it still holds up. Genetic predisposition, which is at the moment only proven, so to speak, with alcohol. And basically all you inherit with genetic predisposition is an increased tolerance for alcohol. Then behavioral environmental, and that is behaviors are role modeled to you and substances are in your environment. So you see these behaviors as options and stress relievers. You see that behavior modeled and it's in your environment, so you do it. And then the addictive potential of the substance. So for example, the substance has to be available, but we have at the moment no genetic predisposition for crack cocaine or tobacco, but obviously those substances are fairly addictive, and perhaps science will find a genetic predisposition. But at the moment, just like I gave you that epigenetics paper that says, okay, whatever traumas your mom or your ancestors had, this might predispose you to certain health conditions. Process addictions, then, are things you do with your body that engage your addictive attention. And basically with those things, there's always some kind of brain reward, there's always some kind of emotional rush, there's a letdown, and then there's seeking the high once you have the letdown. So these could be things like gambling, internet, things with the internet, surfing, chat rooms, internet porn, shopping, gambling, processes with money, spending, credit, overspending, chronic debting, certain forms of religion. Sure, I'm Jesus, that's why I need your wife in an arsenal. When the aliens are coming, kill yourself in the comet to join them. Or, gaming, all these kind of things that can basically engage your attention and provide a certain degree of brain reward and all the other things, just as if they were a drug. Then polyaddictions, many addictions. So polypharmacy is take many drugs to achieve a combination effect. Polyprocesses engage in many types of process addictions. So workaholism, internet relationships, abusive controlling relationships, gambling. And then polyaddictions can also appear as both ingestive and process addictions together. So alcohol, gambling, cocaine, meth, and workaholism, comfort feeding at work, always having cookies and, all these kinds of comfort food, etc. So when we talk about cross addictions, it was originally applied, the original meme was applied to drugs within a drug class in which tolerance to one induces addiction to all. So for example, benzodiazepines, Valium and Xanax and Klonopin, and they're in the same drug class as alcohol, so they're essentially like taking a drink without necessarily the hangover effects, and naturally they can also induce tolerance and become faster addicting than, say, the alcohol itself. Less potent opiates and heroin, or things like OxyContin, which is essentially synthetic heroin. ADHD meds, Ritalin, Cylert, Adderall, to street methamphetamine. And certain ingestive addictions make you prone to process addictions and vice versa. For example, people who become clean and sober, but they become workaholics or food addicts or diabetic. Chronic debtors, sexaholics, relationship addicts, particularly where it's an abusive cycle and it's hard to break out of. Religious fanaticism and sexual abuse and religious fanaticism, well, you may not necessarily think they're fanatics, but certainly the stuff that we've seen with the Catholic Church and other religious organizations certainly gives us cause for pause. Now, addictive organizations. Certain organizations function as if they were an actively practicing individual addict. So these organizations do one of two things. They either produce addicts or codependents, or because they're high stress environments, lots of addicts and codependents they aggregate within them. So definitely off the top, I suspect any organization which sells addictive products or services, and definitely any organization built along governmental or corporate lines, or any organization with a high percentage of codependents, active or recovering addicts, government, military, police, fire, healthcare, education. Yes, I am talking about higher education and Lane. So any organization can be addictive. Not every addictive organization is addictive everywhere. So that's one of the things in terms of the point about society and addiction. These organizations are everywhere. They make up most of society. So the challenge for you as civilians is, well, I'm not paid to deal with this. How do I do good self-care? Well, that's the idea. Do good self-care. And one of the first pieces you need to know is basically, are you in it? Are you in one? And then how bad is it around you? And then what do you do about it? So self-care. Remember that phrase, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, and also what's happening to you. So one of the questions to ask yourself in a self-care context is, how were you wounded? And how did or how do you respond to that wounding, including how you are and are you healing it properly? So as an example, if you to expand that metaphor, is the wounding a scrape? And you just put a little Bactine or, a little rubbing alcohol or a salve or whatever. Is it a burn? Is it a cut? How does it heal properly? Remember, with drug recovery, if it's abstinence, part of itching, just like a cut is healing and it's itching for the brain is boredom. Because remember, from the brain's point of view, drug-taking behavior is like dropping a safe on it, just like Wile E. Coyote, and so it's looking for the safe to fall when you're not using. So boredom becomes a critical issue in terms of dealing with recovery, right? So after you've been abstinent, and this is one of the things that happens within treatment, or theoretically is supposed to happen within treatment, self-healing order of operations, just like in algebra, PILF-DOS. You look at pain, loss, and fear, depression, anger, and you work through those things. You do the hardest things first, and then you get to serenity. So if you go to the center of the greatest pain or the deepest pain or the pain that you're willing to acknowledge, then it becomes about what gives you healing and soothing. If you've experienced a loss and you're grieving something, then pay attention to what's left. What do you have rather than what you lost? If you fear pain and loss, then fear, that acronym, false evidence appearing real, or is, because it's still out, a great movie, After Earth, where Will Smith and his kid are facing some alien monster that actually is pretty much blind except for when humans are afraid around it, and it smells their pheromones and they can see them and attack them. So as long as you are not afraid, then you're invisible to this creature and then you can kill it or whatever, right? So he's basically saying, in that movie, fear is a choice. And so if it's a choice, then what do you do in terms of being able to act through, in spite of your fear, and calm your fear? So pain, loss, fear, depression, anger, any of those things, you could cycle through those things, and being able to completely resolve those things, or at least be able to break out of whatever cycle you're in as a result of those, and get to serenity. So a lot of those things are basically, with pain, it's about healing. With loss, it's about recognizing what's left and building upon that. With fear, it's basically not necessarily looking at what's about to happen, but what's happening in the moment. If there actually is danger, and if there is, get safe. If there's not, build up your courage so that you're able to act and do the things that are most helpful for you, and then eventually getting to serenity, which is not necessarily not feeling. It's basically not being fazed by what's going on around you. So self-empowerment from the Fourfold Way. The warrior showing up and being present at this moment and recognizing there are no ordinary moments. The healer, pay attention to what has heart and meaning, what you feel and what it means to you. The visionary, telling the truth without blame or judgment. And the teacher within. That's the lesson of discipline, to cultivate and to expand upon the teacher within, the teacher that is you, that's part of you. If you look at life is a school, what's the lesson? And what is the optimal outcome I can learn from the situation? And being open to outcome, not necessarily being attached to outcome. Meaning that within the lesson, you why do these things keep happening to you? Well, it's just like in math, just like doing fractions, just like word problems. You keep getting the same combinations or the same types of things thrown at you till you can become ever more skillful. So rather than thinking of, in the school of life, rather than thinking of it as problem-solving exercises, think of them as strength-building exercises, strength and skill-building exercises. So all these are different aspects within you: warrior, healer, visionary, and teacher within. Things that can be practiced daily. So functioning in the presence of pain. So a friend of mine, Terry Tafoya, who is a two-spirited Taos Pueblo Warm Springs storyteller and clinical psychologist, he basically says of the word dysfunctional. So when people used to throw around the term dysfunctional family, right? Now, medically, because this came out of the medical worldview, dysfunctional doesn't mean non-functional. And Terry did a great reframe for which lots of people, well, I've thanked him. Dysfunctional is not non-functional. Dysfunctional is functioning in the presence of great pain, emotionally and otherwise. So, for example, when you're in physical pain, do you not protect the injured part? Well, sure, right. But it's still functional. If you basically have done the healing work, it hurts during the healing process, right? So how do you protect an injured heart or a place where you've been wounded emotionally? Well, one of the things you do, you avoid mention of, deny, or forget that which pains you. In fact, if the trauma is sufficient, there's actually a mechanism within your brain that basically blanks it out. This is basically one of the functions, the positive functions of like PTSD. PTSD is basically operating on the brain's capacity for inducing amnesia in itself, because of trauma, because you can't stand to be the person that terrible thing happened to. And then at some later time, it starts leaking out. I mean, I think of it as a problem in like password encryption. The memory is password encrypted and it leaks out eventually in flashbacks and other things, right? So in great pain. So for example then, within addiction, and you starting with that particular meme, the original medical term for an addict alcoholic was chemically dependent, a chemically dependent person. So any person who was in a primary relationship with a chemically dependent person was called codependent. That's where we got that term and that worldview. So that's anyone. So not just, so a primary relationship is a relationship in which you have not only direct contact with a person, but you have some emotional exchange with them too, on any level. So codependent. So because of that pain, so if they're close enough to see your pain, and if you are functioning in the presence of great pain because of the pain, and this is this came out of a chemically dependent, primarily an alcohol model, but I have to say at the outset that we've seen this with other processes and also other drugs, so not just alcohol. There's 3 rules which are learned in codependent families. Don't talk, so don't talk about what's wrong. Don't trust, that is, they lie or they let you down, so you can't trust them. And don't feel. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And you can see under don't feel, I'm fine, F-I-N-E. That is effed up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. So the classic example of that for me, 16-year-old white female explaining how she felt when her parents bought the line that her injury from her suicide attempt was a cat scratch, which was pretty amazing to me. So, this is high school. I was a mandatory reporter. She comes in with this amazing gash. I'm not understanding how she missed arteries, didn't sever tendons. It was like amazing, really amazing. And so, called parents and said, hey, get her help, et cetera, et cetera. She had talked them out of hospitalizing her and said it was a cat scratch. And they bought it. Now, she didn't want to see me for about 3 months, but she understood why I did it. And basically part of the issue for her was the extreme religiosity of the parents. And so her thing, even though she wasn't a drug user, her thing was basically having a bad boy boyfriend who was also in recovery, having had a bad experience with drugs, but basically straightened his life around, but was still kind of like a death rocker type. And so the good Christian girl who would change her clothes after she left the house, when she got to school, and being a boyfriend, remember she's supposed to be a virgin, et cetera, the whole dual life thing, right? And part of her thing was, she felt betrayed by her parents that they bought the lie, that it was a cat scratch. And, having been a parent, being a parent then, okay, they're scared. You feel a failure as a parent when your kid wants to kill themselves, and all you have to fall back on is your Christian faith, which is not necessarily giving you answers other than pray more, which, really, hospitalization, that wouldn't work, wouldn't necessarily. I've seen her as an adult, she's fine. But, So she was the original reason for that emotional equation. You've heard me talk about anger denied expression multiplied by some number, n equals depression. That was the suicide equation, because she couldn't be angry. She couldn't talk with them about that. So in that sense, they were kind of addicted to a particular form of religion that didn't necessarily help them with, or help their daughter with her, the pain and angst of growing up in an adolescent framework in the 20th century. And she basically felt, she was in a codependent relationship with a recovering addict, but acting out addictive behavior too, right? So codependent rules. Now, within those codependent rules, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Recovery, which can be found by any family member at any time, consists of breaking the rules. So you can't break the rules till you know how to play the game. Talking, knowing where, what, and with who to talk. I just got the impulse to give you this. What's the difference between a madman and a saint? I'll even write it down. The basic difference between a madman and a saint is they may see the exact same reality accurately. The madman just spews out to everybody. The saint knows who to talk to and what to say to whom, including nothing. Because some things can't be talked about. But if you know exactly what to say to whom, if you can see a certain level of truth, you can basically speak that truth minimally. Don't overshare. This is like oversharing. The madman overshares. The saint, just enough to get over, to have the effect, right? So, breaking those codependent rules, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Learning what to say, where, what, and with whom to say. Here's a thing where LCC becomes an addictive organization. Even assuming the instructor is not an addict, alcoholic, or in recovery, there is basically a phenomenon, for example, as part of a writing class, where students will basically share their lives. And I'm trained to deal with that material, but your English teacher is not, and they freak. Some of them, the older hands, get used to that, right? But, if you share your abuse history and all that kind of stuff, some of us are mandatory reporters, and if you don't want that, we might have to do something, because maybe we don't want you to kill yourself, or maybe we don't want you to be abused. We're government employees, right? So we kind of have to act in the best interest of society, which might mean getting you help whether you want it or not. I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't, but, students are very open about that. There's not necessarily, again, I'm not discouraging people from sharing, but the other thing is, understand the rule about talking. Talk with the people who are trained to deal, if you're dealing with and revealing heavy stuff, understand the effect of that on people. This is why, for example, if you go through a breakup, your friends get quickly burnt out, and your friends, your friends and their friends, your ex's friends, they take sides, right? And so if you've ever gone through that, it's like people get tired of you talking about it. Except maybe your closest friends who also might get tired of talking about it. So the issue about talking, talk about where you can disclose, what you can disclose, and then with whom you can disclose. Be careful about that, is all. Trusting. Who to trust and how far do you trust them? This is again an issue of boundaries. Who burns you? Or who has burned you? How have they burned you? And then don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. So knowing what you feel and how to meet your needs without being needed to be needed or overly needy. Being self-sufficient with your needs. Knowing those boundaries there too. So these are like at least three steps on the road to recovery for people who are in codependent relationships. And those three rules: don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Breaking those rules: talking, trusting, and knowing what you feel, which is probably the chief skill, I think. All right? So, again, taking the meme from substance abuse, and particularly alcoholic families, these classic roles are basically survival adaptations. They're roles to cope with the stress the family is going. They're not selected by choice. These roles can appear in the absence of chemical dependency and response to any major stressor, disease, illness, abuse, systemic discrimination, boundary violations of all kinds. And developing the qualities of resiliency can help you through these stressors. So re-establishing existing boundaries which were violated or non-existent if you didn't learn them. So in high school, to illustrate this, I used to have this cool mobile, or I would use live models from the class, but since there's not enough of you to do this, I'm going to have to rely on my drawing skills. All right? This is not necessarily to say that this is only a heterosexual couple, but remember, here's what the model of what the normal and alcoholic family. All right, so the normal family had 2.3 kids. Heterosexuals, 2.3 kids, right? Alcoholic families had 4 to 5 plus kids. I'm not sure, when I would ask this, like, okay, so is that sloppy birth control? Is it, what? Where is that coming from? Well, this is why they basically had those 4 roles. So how does that work, right? They wouldn't answer, right? So let's say you have a boy, a girl, and a boy. In the old model where mom worked in the home and dad was, the breadwinner, et cetera, the ward cleaver, leave it to beaver, Ozzie and Harriet kind of family, 2 parents in the home, blah, 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 right? So there's a balance here, right? Okay? So we used to then symbolize let's say it doesn't really matter who's the drinker, but let's say classically it's dad, right? The American drug cycle of, coffee and amphetamines and cigarettes in the day, alcohol to bring you down off of that, and then start it all over again. Right? So let's say that dad's in the bottle. I know this looks like a bong, but whatever. Works the same, really. All right? So this person is kind of like wrapped in their own world. And the way I used to illustrate this is you take a bottle, look through it. So when we were staging this with live people, put this person up on a chair. When I say action, look through the bottle. What do you see? Well, not too much. Very good. Exactly. So when they're, so the addict or alcoholic is involved with the bottle, this person becomes the chief codependent. And they're basically engaged with taking care of them. Protecting their use, calling in, enabling, that's probably where that is where the enabling behavior of that term came from within describing these systems. All right? So codependent roles. 4 typical roles children can use to adapt to the stress of this particular family situation. The super coper, family heroine, notice the spelling. That's female hero, that's not the drug. Drug is spelled without an E at the end. Super coper, family heroine or hero. Basically what they do, so flip a coin, boy or girl? Okay. Let's say firstborn child. This kid becomes little mom. Well, and dad. Because both parents are, out of the loop. So this person raises the family. Now, I've actually seen it, I actually had dinner with the child of a couple that I knew from working in high school and their kid. So I didn't know the kid, but the kid reminded me that I knew his parents, and that they were pretty heavy users back in high school, grew up, had a family, and basically this was the kid who was raising his younger siblings. Right? So, super coper takes over the role of the parent in the home. Basically, the outside world sees a workaholic, a successful perfectionist. This person will have straight A's. They will, often be in athletics. Captain of the football team, head cheerleader. So if you remember that whole meme that I talked about with, the captain of the football team and the head cheerleader, drinking all that much, that was them. Multi-generational children of alcoholics. They were the super coper. Straight A's, but loaded, Now, often it could work either way in terms of whether these folks actually use or not themselves. The parents' use can actually drive them away from using, but they're still codependent. The next one is the scapegoat. So they often will take, let's just alternate gender balance. Let's say this is a boy. Takes the blame for the addict's use in the family. You're driving your father to drink. They act out. They can either get pregnant or get other people pregnant. Often involved with alcohol and other drugs or criminal activity. particularly in opposition to whatever the addict and alcoholic are doing. So because what they see is, well, we already have a family hero or heroine, I have to distinguish myself, so I'll be the bad kid. The lost child. The lost child copes through being in a private world. This is the kid, for example, in elementary school who nobody notices, not even the teacher. Elementary school, middle school, they're the ones that have an invisible friend. They have a rich inner imagination. So their response to this family situation is essentially to withdraw into their own world, stay in their room, all that kind of stuff. And then the family mascot, family clown, and they cope with stress by laughter. Their joking lightens the seriousness. There's a theme in the blues, laughing to keep from crying. So, for example, there are many famous comedians who were children of alcoholics. Carol Burnett's one. Richard Pryor was another. A guy, Titus, was another. I mean, basically, for example, that on cable, that show Shameless, that's an example of multi-level dysfunction in addition to substance abuse, mental illness, criminality, et cetera, et cetera. So family, mascot, and clown. Now, I gotta say, because these roles, though the meme was originally developed from alcoholic families, children of alcoholics in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s when this first got expounded, and also into the 80s, we actually can see this with other kinds of stressors too. So, for example, there was, anybody seen the movie Schindler's List? Okay, so Nazi Holocaust, right? So there was a friend of mine who worked in prevention at the time. There was this whole controversy about at Castlemont High School, which used to be in a wealthy area in Oakland, white flight made it mostly minority, busing, et cetera, et cetera. So history class where the teacher showed the movie Schindler's List, but without telling the kids about what the Holocaust was. So all they knew was that it was a Steven Spielberg movie. No context, nothing about World War II, just, Schindler's List. So the scene in which they're building a latrine. The prisoners of war are building a latrine. And there's a Jewish woman who's an architect, and she's saying, wait, the foundation's wrong on this latrine. It's gonna collapse if you build it this way. We gotta, stop, tear it down, et cetera, et cetera. And she's trying to explain this to the colonel, who gets impatient and just shoots her in the head. The kids started laughing at that. And, news of that got out, and people were going, oh, these insensitive kids, these insensitive black kids, blah, de, blah, de, blah. So they were able to get Spielberg to come up from LA to do a, special assembly filming, and, so they show the film, the Q&A, and et cetera, et cetera. And so this black girl stands up and she says, thank you for coming. This whole thing got blown out of proportion. The reason why we laughed is because it looked fake. Because I've seen my friends get their head blown off in front of me. And it didn't look anything like that. Like many times, more than once. Right? So think of the trauma there, right? And she said, okay, so dead silence in the room. She said, and by the way, so all we were told, we weren't told anything about the Holocaust. We were just told it was a Steven Spielberg, movie, So wait, aren't you the guy who did Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Indiana Jones movies? Yes. Okay. So there's a scene in there where in the first movie, Indiana Jones is, facing this guy, who's got a sword and et cetera, and he whips out his gun and he shoots him. Ha, 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 right? For laughs, right? And then in the second Indiana Jones movie, same thing, guy, he's facing another guy, except he goes for his gun, no gun, ha, 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 right? So we just thought it was a Steven Spielberg movie, and boom, woman gets shot in the head, looks fake, ha, ha, ha. Right? Which doesn't entirely excuse it, but, looks like, okay, some people's response to stress and trauma is by displacing the feeling and laughing about it, because that's the only way they can handle repeated stress. If they learned that particularly in her home, then later on found out that, yes, she not only had witnessed neighborhood trauma, you got to cope with that, right? So part of the piece then, in terms of looking at the chief codependent, the non-using spouse role, the role is basically to shield the addict, alcoholic from the consequences of using. If they use two, they help protect the supply. So if both are using, then you have a dynamic with two addicts. Gets even more chaotic and more, if you can imagine that. All right? Now, if they get in recovery, because it's often possible that they get in recovery, because in codependency, you don't have to be the one who's using, you just have to be in a relationship with a user. Because of the actions of the user, it's often possible that this person will basically be averse to using and stay clean and sober, but then what will happen is that the kids will either be the users or it will skip a generation. We've seen that happen too. So if they get in recovery, they can serve as a healthy nucleus for the family system in terms of resiliency, right? So you don't have to be sick with the addict, you can also model health. And often we will see this too. So codependency reinforces weakness. And you need a weak addict to look strong and to be a helper. And this is a dynamic we often see in terms of the addict not necessarily getting help or being blocked or sabotaged in treatment. Because what happens if they get in recovery and who is this person? We don't know you. Is this the real you? We like the drunk better. Sometimes there is that dynamic. A lot of, anger and resentment from the stuff that has gone on before, from the person not being present, and then that has to be dealt with in therapy. So the super coper, if we go this role by role, right? They take over the role of the parent in the home. The outside world can see the workaholic or successful perfectionist. They represent the family to the world outside the family. Basically, the look good as addicts and alcoholics we'll talk about within 12-step framework. Be a straight A student, star athlete, the go-getter. Their success out in the world is used to cover inner shame. So recovery can mean opening up to dealing with feelings of inadequacy, driving the push, and shame, driving their push for success. Not always. There's nothing wrong with succeeding. And notice our society does reinforce workaholism. This would not be a bad thing. But they are suffering inside, and they will eventually fall apart, or often do. The scapegoat. is a blunt truth teller. They may be the first person into recovery as an act of rebellion. And if they don't recover from their anger will rule them. So there'll often be kind of anger management issues, particularly if there's been physical abuse in the family as a result of the alcoholic's activities. So anger is hurt. Within that scapegoat, they take the blame in the family for causing the addict's use. They act out, seek attention, gets pregnant or get others pregnant, often involved with A&D issues, criminal activity. But part of their recovery is that they can be the blunt truth teller. The lost child copes by withdrawing into that private world. In the classroom, they're invisible. The kid that nobody sees or no one notices, their strengths are a vivid imagination. They have a rich inner world. They're keen observers. They can often be authors and artists with a great deal of insight. So when Angie, for example, talks about, the addictive side of the fourfold way, basically looking at, okay, these are shadow sides that are unresolved. Basically, she's saying there's a way of flipping those shadow sides to be more optimal in that whatever those particular roles are. Family mascot and clown, basically coping with stress by laughter, lightens the seriousness. Some people have made a career out of comedy like this, and there are lots of examples like this within popular culture and historically. So these roles can appear by birth order. So in the order I introduced them, super coper, scapegoat, lost child, and clown. They can appear all in one person over the person's lifespan. They can change over a person's lifetime so that the scapegoat can become the hero and the hero can be the scapegoat when they fall apart later. So they can appear without chemical abuse in the presence of environmental stress. So without active recovery, truth-telling, soul searching, or actually finding your soul and expressing it, these people often become chemically dependent or die of stress-related diseases. They're high risk for entering relationships with chemically dependent persons, replicating the situation that was in their family because it's home. So when I talk about, people and their picker software, like going to relationship school, why do I keep, having these abusive relationships? Where'd you come from? What's home? Keep looking at that. So they'll duplicate their roles in future families, communities, and in the workplace. So for example, when I said, when I was first, learning this construct in the 80s, Ronald Reagan's daughter wrote a book that basically is kind of a tell-all book, but she said, my father is a child of an alcoholic. And so as a child of, and further beyond that, besides being a child of an alcoholic, I would say that there's some evidence. We asked a number of mental health professionals about this as well, and basically there's a school of thought that feels that he actually had Alzheimer's all the entire time he was in the White House, too, and that basically just got covered up. So part of being a child of an alcoholic in the White House, then you gather around you as the CEO, people who replicate your worldview and your practices, right? So you can have the Attorney General, Edmund Meese, when there are millions of homeless on the streets of America, and that was when it was only 4 million. Say, The homeless are anecdotal. Doesn't exist. I remember the Carter campaign, rather 1980. How many of you were alive then? Okay, so 1980, I was in LA. Reagan was campaigning against Carter on the day of the worst historical smog break then in LA at that time. So remember, Ronald Reagan was, governor when I was in high school. So he had said on the day of the worst historical smog break in LA in 1980 that while he was governor, he'd completely eliminated the smog problem. Well, governor in the 70s. And the next day, he said, and you probably see this in, what was that movie where Woody Harrelson is playing the campaign advisor for McCain, and somebody's playing Sarah Palin. So anyway, he comforts Sarah Palin by saying, yeah, Reagan said that trees cause smog. And so that's what he said the next day, that not only had he eliminated the smog problem, but the next day he said that trees cause more air pollution than cars. And so what? Wait a minute, that doesn't even make sense. So one of his aides explained it by saying, oh, well, he was confusing the difference between nitrous oxide and nitrogen dioxide. Really? That doesn't make sense either. So, okay, yes, one is a constituent in smog and one is naturally occurring, but trees make more air pollution than cars. No, that's why you're clear-cutting redwoods, but okay, whatever. So, distortions in reality, right? So those codependent roles. Here's a autobiography in 5 short chapters by Portia Nelson. Chapter 1. This is basically written from the point of view of a codependent person or a person who grew up in an alcoholic family. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I'm hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in this same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit, but my eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Okay, so recovery is possible, right? As long as you, and her message, I believe, is basically taking responsibility, not blaming, the pain of the dysfunctional family. Yeah, all that happened. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, acknowledging what happened to you and taking responsibility for your own healing and your own recovery is part of the key in this. So it's written from the point of view of a codependent. It describes the shit happens factor or random anomalous events occur. You didn't see it coming. You weren't looking. You were numb to your feelings. Okay? Those patterns can be detected in behavior. Hence, this is why in your assignments, why we track behavior and how you feel. Okay? You were blocking out your feelings, not feeling because you're too busy taking care of someone else, which is part of the whole codependency thing. I think you can find in codependent jokes online, one of my favorites is, you're codependent if you are dying and someone else's life flashes in front of your eyes. So recovery process starts with emotions, and process addictions more than ingestive addictions. So if you're the addict yourself, you're using to cover up the feelings, so not using is only the start. Your body has to recover, and part of the recovery is this. Your brain's been battered by chemicals. It's not an exaggeration like being hit by a baseball bat or a safe or a piano being dropped on it. So just like traumatic brain injury, TBI, there's recovery time. And the brain's recovery is boredom. Okay? It's not actually being bored, but being dazed, confused. This passes with time, nutrition, exercise, and also exercising the brain, too. So there's dimensions of being in recovery. Have you seen this before? All right. So you should know this as civilians, because various friends of yours will be in processes of quitting, and you will be in various stages of quitting yourself. So physical recovery, this is the substance abuse model, 1 to 3 years of non-use, no substitutes, i.e., to recover from meth, you have to have at least 3 years of continuous abstinence from meth. And optimally, like nothing else. So, yeah, you might be 3 years clean and sober from meth, but have been chipping on weed. Not recovery. Okay? So, physical, 1 to 3 years of non-use. No substitutes. Emotional, as soon as chemical stabilization begins. That is, and I'm defining this from an abstinence model, it could also mean that if you were dually diagnosed and the substance created a mental illness, and then abstaining from the substance begins to stabilize you, or you might be on stabilizing meds. As soon as chemical stabilization begins, looking at what happened to you and what damage it did emotionally, where and how much does it hurt, what did you do to numb yourself, and what do you do with the feelings that are coming up as a result of your numbing yourself. So this particular stage can basically start in the first couple of months, but definitely after the first year. Okay? Mental. What are the memes, the patterns, the programs that you ran, the programs that run you? What do you need to let go of or change or learn accurately, objectively? How do you feel about it? How does it feel to move towards health? Do you self-sabotage yourself? So physical, emotional, mental, and then spiritual. Where are you connected, and how do you become more connected? How deep can you go in that connection? So starting with those things, so mental health. Codependency by itself can cause distortions in reality to accommodate an addictive reality. So if you've been traumatized without being given help or access to tools, concepts, a daily praxis that is a practice that's driven from a working theory, and that theory gets modified by what you do and adapted to you personally. A daily practice for healing, healing and thriving, something that you can personally do every day. If your role models use substances and you may or may not use substances, what would the system's response be? Well, you know. So dual diagnosis. Part of the system's response is labeling. So, which may get you treatment. As far as treatment goes, which is as far as the established accepted medical practice goes, which they're only going to do it if it's been profitable, if there's enough people with your same condition for them to make money from the drug, since the reliance has been on big pharma, right? Okay, which might be slightly better than, oh, sorry, you went through all those horrific experiences. You really need to work on those issues. Got insurance for counseling? No? Here, take these pills. So I might be exaggerating slightly. Okay, you have a psych diagnosis. People have psych diagnosis, which describes symptoms and how you might act as a result of them. The cure, if you read DSM-5, 4R before it, the cure is implied but not always described in the diagnosis. So usually after you're given meds, after your 50-minute counseling hour, if you got a 15-minute counseling hour, which a lot of people don't, it might be just 15 minutes, oh, our time is up. The counselor may give you homework to do before the next session, but the bottom line, for example, then dual diagnosis is an addiction on top of a mental health condition. I described that before. One may have led to the other. So, for example, untreated mental illness, self-medicated with neurotoxic addictive drugs, or untreated substance abuse with toxic addictive drugs, both lead to brain damage and resulting in mental illness. So drugs can make you crazy, obviously, then, and you're crazy while on the drugs. So the drugs can simulate, like, meth, for example, can simulate bipolar. The medical protocol is basically abstinence from street drugs for 6 months. If the mental illness clears, it was the drugs. If the mental illness doesn't clear, we'll give you stabilizing meds and therapy and more stabilizing meds. So don't use illegal substances on top of your meds, and don't use other people's meds. Now, one of the things that we find is that people, in order to handle the side effects from the meds, people will smoke weed on top of their meds, which, even with so-called medical marijuana, so-called meaning we don't know how much, we're not doing testing, so all we know is the strain and how stoned it gets you. No dosage, right? So that's not medicine. You need known dose for a specific condition, etc. So certain drugs and interactions. So a little pharmacology in our last 5 minutes or so. Dosage, and right on time. Hey, dosage has to do with how much of the active ingredient of the drug is present. Now this becomes critical. So for example, you would have to eat like a handful of white willow bark or boil a bunch of white willow bark in tea to get a little salicylic acid. That's the active ingredient in aspirin. One report that I saw on bath salts posited that bath salts were from the cannabis plant, and they were rare, relatively rare in the cannabis plant, and they were able to chemically separate them out and concentrate them so that they were in amounts that you would never get in any grown cannabis, so they produced wild hallucinatory effects, right? So the idea is that dosage has to do with how much of the active ingredient in the drug is present, okay? Potency has to do with how powerful the drug is within its class, how strong it is. So for example, beer and wine. So, Bud Light, 2% beer, Terminator Stout, 8% beer, more potent. Distilled spirits, 14, 30, 35 to, 100 proof. Opium, morphine, heroin, fentanyl, etc. okay, stronger within their particular class. So, as we learned early on, all drugs have effects. Side effects is a marketing term for normal effects of the drug that exist, but you can't make money from them, but you still have to declare. So you have to tolerate, and you build tolerance to different drug effects at different rates with each particular drug. So for example, any drug that you take to get high, that is euphoria, or you take for pain relief, your nervous system was designed to adapt. And usually euphoria and pain relief are the first effects to go. I was at a conference Friday in which I'll try and incorporate some of the stuff, but one of the things they did experimentally was play around with that idea and give some people, whether it was alcohol or marijuana, some people were told they were getting alcohol or marijuana and didn't get it, and there were other people who were told that they weren't going to get it and then did get it within that particular framework, whatever. And there was an interesting effect in terms of placebos where people were actually acting as if they were stoned or drunk when there was nothing there. So they were basically saying that tolerance was kind of like the expectations. In this particular work, it's called expectancies. What you expect to have happen has a great effect on tolerance. Like you can actually not have the drug be present, but your expectancies ramp up your nervous system so that when the drug doesn't hit, you actually have a withdrawal-like effect. All right, so anyway, you tolerate the different drug effects at different rates with each particular effect. So this is why people will often take more of the same drug attempting to duplicate that effect. So drug interactions, additive, 2 or more different drugs in different drug categories, acting on different parts of the brain and nervous system. For example, caffeine and alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant, caffeine is a stimulant, but they don't cancel each other out. You're just simply awake for the accident. Marijuana and caffeine. So speedballs or parachutes, depending, heroin and stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine. And let's just stop here, and we'll continue on Thursday. Till then. Roll music.